Dear audience, I think it's time to start our conversation here today. So welcome to the FIA event, a conversation with Samir Saran on where is India headed. And my name is Katja Kreutz, and I'm the Program Director of the Global Security and Governance Program. And it's a great pleasure of mine to welcome you to this event and also to moderate this discussion with India's leading foreign policy expert, Samir Saran, who is the president of the Observer Research Foundation. And welcome. And I want to add that Mr. Saran curates the Raisina dialogue, and he has authored several books, articles, and he's a commentator in media very frequently. So you recognize yourself from this description, I hope.
I think so.
Excellent. And we were saying with the colleagues that Finnish interest in India and Indian affairs have been on the rise in the last years, as has India. And also our institute has been cooperating on Indian affairs with the Nordic sister institutes, and we are glad to host also think tank meetings before the summit, upcoming summit this fall. And India has been also featuring in some publications of ours, but I admit we can develop our knowledge of India and our expertise in this branch even further. But time is scarce, and I want to leave a few minutes for questions and discussion at the end as well. So let us move on to the discussion. And I want to start with the global rise of India, which I think few could deny at this point. And I would like to ask you for the first question, what are the main factors explaining India's rise globally?
So thank you for having me, and let me first thank FIA for hosting this conversation. Let me thank all of you for interrupting your summer breaks and joining us for this conversation. Of course, as I was told by the hosts, I hope this is the beginning of far more intense and far more regular conversations that feature the relationship between this region and India. We are celebrating 75 years of diplomatic relations, so let me also acknowledge colleagues from the Indian Embassy here. Mayank, who's going to be holding fort, is also a part of our Raisina Diplomats program, the Young Diplomats program, where he was a member, along with a Finnish diplomat, by the way. Mm-hmm. So I'm sure in the days ahead, we will see far more exciting conversations unfolding as the ties deepen between our two regions. What is driving India's rise? I think, to me, India has always been an important actor. And the world is rediscovering India, and the Indians are rediscovering the world with certain new priorities in mind. One of them, of course, happens to be the fact that we are a young country with a very aspirational population that is seeking more, that is seeking better standards of living, that is seeking more sustainable ways of existence, and for that it's seeking partnerships around the world. So our sustainable development agenda and our growth agenda compels us to find partnerships around the world that will cater to that particular agenda. I think that's the first priority, that we are growing and we seek partnerships, we seek friendships, we seek solutions, we want to share solutions, and we want to be in relationships with countries that are that have positive agendas as well. And I think that's the first driver. The second, of course, is that geopolitically, the region where we are located is increasingly more important to the world. Not only because it is the economic dynamo of the world, where much of the growth transpires, much of the global trade and shipping passes through, and where much of the future and current energy is either consumed or produced or managed. So in some sense, that region is far too important, and we are at the heart of that region. So if you think about the Indo-Pacific, we are the soul. And in some sense, if the Indo-Pacific is a crucial element of the future of the global puzzle, we are an important piece of that puzzle. And in that sense, you are finding more reasons to engage with India or from a political lens. And I think that is also happening simultaneously. And the third and most important element is that that in the last decade certainly, but I would argue since pretty much the turn of the century, India's role in the world has moved from being a passive participant or a loud opposition to now a global manager. And I think that is one big transformation that has taken place. You look at any big global disaster, catastrophe, emergency situations that have happened in this century, in the last 24, 25 years, and you would find the Indian contingent and the Indian flag being right amongst the first, second or third countries to have reached that place. So what happened in Turkey, what happened in the Indian Ocean, tsunami, you see that our role has changed. We are now providers of global public goods. Indian technology solutions are helping countries around the world change their lives. For example, the digital public goods that we launched, the DPI initiative that we launched under the Indian G20 presidency. Similarly, Indian development assistance and Indian development support has bailed out countries not only in South Asia from critical economic distress, but also in Africa and other parts of the world. So now we are part of that global framework that also offers essential public goods to the world. So our own growth ambitions, our geopolitical position, and our ability to help others is something that is driving a renewed assessment of India in many people's eyes.
So are there any challenges then to sort of further manifestation of India?
Of course there are challenges. One of the biggest challenges is our neighborhood. We have been blessed with everything but good neighbors, and we have to manage our neighbors. So I mean, by the way, so even you have neighbors, but so you understand what I'm saying.
Yes,
but so do we.
do.
So in that sense, our neighborhood is not an easy neighborhood, and in some ways, it is both an opportunity, that neighborhood. It's a young, dynamic neighborhood. Lots of economic possibilities if we get our politics right. If we can create the frameworks for peace and prosperity for all, that could be a very beneficial part of the world. Unfortunately, we have actors who are disruptive, who are revisionist, and who are seeking to change the way global trade and global governance is conducted and mitigated. And in that sense, that is one challenge, external factors. The other challenge, of course, is that can our own reforms and can our own governance keep up with the demands and the steep expectations from our own young population? When you are young and you are hungry and you are demanding, governments sometimes have to work twice as fast if they have to keep up with the expectations of their own people. But as our elections demonstrate, elections that just got completed and the new government that is formed, it just showed that we still have deep faith in the ballot box. We still solve our problems through elections, and all parties respect outcomes. And that is most important. We fight in a very determined fashion. If you were watching the elections over 2 months, you would have thought that this is nearly World War III, the way the communication was transpiring between parties. But the day the elections ended and the results came out, everyone accepted the results. Everyone is celebrating themselves as the victors, and everyone has moved on to the parliament and it's business as usual. So everyone is happy, everyone has won, and India continues. But I think that's important, that we still have we are one of the few geographies of the world, and thank God for that, where 16% of humanity is determined to solve their problems by going into the hustings and finding a solution and then respecting it for the next 5 years. And I think that is something unique about India.
And 2 months elections, that's impressive.
Well, it's 16% of humanity.
It's
and if you see some interesting documentaries, we create election infrastructure where even one person has to vote. So we have actually taken election infrastructure to spaces where there are barely a few individuals who are going to be casting their votes. So it is an exercise which is universal and which is inclusive, like nowhere else in the world. This is remarkable. This is an Indian passion. Democracy and elections are an Indian passion. I always joke that in earlier times, in the last century, when we used to have the old method of using the paper ballots, and people used to capture votes and stuff the ballot boxes, like for example, the US has been complaining about, some sides in the US have been complaining about stuffing the ballot boxes with paper. Even then, in those days, people wanted to gain legitimacy by winning elections, not by bypassing elections. And I think that's the important part, that it's a central part of who we are as people. Elections are important for India.
So moving on, in some interviews you've been saying that we live in an ABC world. Would you care to open that up? And how does India fit into that picture?
No, look, I am not saying we live in an ABC world. I think that's, and I don't think that we should be living there at all.
No.
ABC means anybody but China. But that is not, I think you have used the right phrase, ABC, but not in the right context. My point here was that we are creating two sorts of clubs. A club, which are Chinese clubs, and where it's the Chinese rules that define the purpose, the outcomes, the directions, the agenda. And then there are clubs where there is everybody in it but China, and where we are basically having conversations which seem to be far more reflective of the origins of global governance itself. And there is a cleavage between the two. There is a gap between the two that is creating dysfunctionality today. That all of you sitting in this room perhaps may feel that you are inclined and have greater affinity to the US. But if you start looking at the deeper engagements that you are, perhaps your daily lives are implicated by, you will find China might be a more important actor in your lives, from what you eat, what you wear, how you drive your cars, and the batteries, and the equipments in your home, and the essential items that you produce. So I think we are living in a world which is deeply interconnected. There are two systems that don't necessarily seem to be compatible with each other, and we need to find ways of having conversations that make China responsible and make China responsive to global expectations of a power as big and as large as them. And by the way, for the rest, develop some spine and stand up to the Chinese and tell them that this is acceptable and this is not acceptable. So I think there needs to be a two-way conversation which is fair. I mean, look, I think it's always been fair to China. They have grown at our expense. And in some ways, the global governance and global infrastructure and global public goods and the North American system, Europe-American partnership, has underwritten the Chinese growth. In fact, I always say that Chinese growth story is made in America. It's the last big thing America made. It was China, and now they have to deal with it. But in some sense, the Chinese now must spawn other upcoming countries as well, and they must share the benefits they had from the global system with others. That's the point I'm making here.
Thank you, and we'll move on to China a bit later, I presume. But moving on to the global order and how India sees that. You hosted last year in India a very successful G20 summit. So how does India see really the multilateral order? We were a bit into that already in the last question. And maybe G20 and these more informal versus the UN system. And we have the Summit of the Future coming up in the fall. How does India see the future of UN, and or is the future with G20 and G clubs?
Look, India is a founding member of the UN, and India treats multilateralism with utmost respect. India is a beneficiary of multilateralism, and India is a defender of multilateralism. India is a actor that believes in evolution and not revolution. India seeks reforms. India seeks bold reforms. India seeks contemporary reforms to make the institution responsive to what's happening today, be it on critical domains like climate and sustainability and the food crises and peace and security that is clearly failing us. You know, you are sitting in a place where peace and security is now itself a big question mark, right? So the UN system and its original purpose needs to be protected. People who need to be able to do that are not members of that club, the P5 specifically, the Security Council. There is need for bold reforms. There is need to revive this organization. Otherwise, you're going to make it redundant. All of us who believe in multilateralism must believe in a reformed United Nations system. and I say United Nations system, not just the Security Council, but also its financial, economic, and trade arm. So be it the Bretton Woods and the bank and the funds, or be it even the trading organizations which are on life support right now. So I think there is a need for all of us to realize that the last 75, 80 years, which were largely peaceful for many of us, not all of us, which were beneficial for many of us, not all of us, it needs to be reviewed. That system needs to be improved so that now it includes more people, it benefits everyone and not just some, and it is able to retain its ability to act in an age which is very different to what 1945 presented us. So there is a time for it to be dramatically reformed, right? So that's one part of it. G20 is certainly a club that is important while multilateralism itself is under stress. So I call these complementary organizations which are supporting multilateralism. It is certainly not as inclusive as the UN General Assembly is, clearly, but it is certainly more inclusive than the G7 was. So the idea that G7 or seven European countries, many of them former colonizers, should be still adjudicating on the future of the world was distasteful, and it was I would say obscene in many ways that such a body existed in this date and age. So I think the G20 is a very positive step to make it a more inclusive forum where you have countries from the south participate and sit alongside countries of the north and try to find solutions. Now I think Indonesia did a commendable job in keeping the G20 alive during very difficult times. India did a fantastic job that in those same difficult times and even more polarized moments that the second year of the conflict was presenting, we were able to not only create a consensus, but also a very ambitious document that for the first time moved the G20 from being a bankers G20, looking at the rich world's problems, and now focusing on development G20, becoming a development G20 and focusing on the problem of the global south. So I think the G20 has shown dexterity in responding to the needs of our times, and perhaps there is a lesson that needs to be drawn while we sit and rescript the future of multilateralism itself.
And also inclusiveness is important, I realize and understand, but you also have participated and participating in what we could term minilateral cooperation formats, so Quad and also the BRICS. And I know
and SCO.
Yes, exactly. And here, especially BRICS in Finland is, I think, a bit sort of, we really don't understand the value of it. Well, BRICS plus, maybe later. Let's get back to that later. But so maybe a word on these minilateral formats and also the role of BRICS and BRICS expanding. So,
look, all of these forums, minilaterals, plurilaterals, you can call them what you want, are basically attempts by countries to find solutions where multilateralism is not able to deliver. Please understand, a weak multilateral system is going to compel us to have these smaller groups to try and find solutions amongst like-minded countries. And that is the reality. In an ideal world where the UN was functioning, we would not require any of these. We would have ante-rooms in the UN itself where 3 or 4 countries would coordinate positions, and then they will go to the General Assembly and argue for a certain direction. When you don't have those ante-rooms, and when the General Assembly itself is dysfunctional, when the Security Council has egregious actors, all 5 of them by the way, have been in breach of every covenant that they should be protecting, they have signed up for, you will come up with minilateral forums. G7 itself was one of such forums, egregious forums that existed. So why speak about BRICS? Let's start with the G7. What was the need for a G7, right? So similarly, BRICS was exactly a counter to that kind of a forum, where those who were not given an ability to participate in decision making decided to come together. That was the only common factor that brought the BRICS together. Originally the 4 countries and then South Africa, and now of course a few more. But the purpose here was for those who were outside of the head table or the main table in the dining room to collaborate and collectively be able to express what they disapproved of in the global system, and that was the genesis of groupings such as the BRICS. Nothing more, nothing less.
It's of course interesting that global governance and these forums are sort of complementing, but also maybe rivaling a bit. But do you believe that it's possible to reform the UN?
Do I believe? I'm an optimist. I believe. I'm a possibilist. I truly look. Okay, reforms will happen. The question is, then will we need a World War III for those reforms to take place? Or will we find political leadership before such an eventuality? So do we have to wait for a major global event, after which we go back to the drawing boards and shape a institution fit for purpose? Or are we wise enough to do it before that? This can't hold. We are actually now looking at perhaps a decade that has been more terrifying than any other since the previous century, maybe 100 years ago. We are looking at times that are really difficult at this moment, and it's happening. It began with Afghanistan in this decade. Then you had the pandemic. Then you had Ukraine. Now you had the Middle East. And by the way, these are all ongoing. None of them is going away, right? And you have so many hotspots in Africa that most of us ignore. We've already had 2 or 3 significant eruptions there. This is a very long decade. In the last 4 years, we have lived a quarter of a century in terms of the intensity of events and occurrences that we have seen, and it tells you that will it happen is not a question. When will it happen and what will it take to make it happen is the bigger question. Do we require a complete meltdown for a reform to take place, or will we have political wisdom prevail before that?
Let's hope the latter, but also uncertain about that. So more about India's role in the global south, and the Raisina dialogue in, was it 2023, also mentioned lighthouse in the tempest. And I think yourself, you have referred to India being a North Star in the global south. So can India be a valid leader of the global south? And if yes, why is that? Is it the democracy factor?
Look, I think India should not aspire to be the leader of a pack. I think that is a dangerous place to aspire to be in a very fast changing and evolving world. Leadership is not sought and acquired. Leadership is perhaps earned and is displayed, and I think that is it's a quality. It is not a goalpost, and I think that's the first problem I have with the pursuit of leadership of anything, including the global south. And if it is a quality, I think if you look at the journey of India since 1947, right, we're going to be celebrating 80 years in 3 years' time of our independence. And by all counts, Indian journey has been fairly remarkable. The most important aspect of that remarkable journey has been, like I just mentioned earlier, our commitment and our faith, a universal faith on democratic processes for deciding our political leadership and those who govern us, for electing those who govern us. So that's been a remarkable part, that we have been steadfast in maintaining that commitment over these 80 years. More recently, in the last 3 decades, but certainly in the last 10 years or 15 years, turn of the century again, maybe the last 2 decades, you have seen India emerge as an economic engine of the world. Last year itself, India contributed 15% of all global growth. For a country with 4% global GDP, it contributes 15% of all growth. So when we grow, you grow. Our growth is not only helping us grow, but it is helping the world grow. So in some sense, we are also now an engine of growth for the world. And this is going to increase. Perhaps it's going to double in the next decade and a half. And we are going to be partners in your prosperity and well-being as well, even as we improve the lives of our own people. And I think that's the second quality of India. But the third and most important element is that our growth is contextual for 7 billion people. When we find a solution for energy, it is affordable, it is accessible, and it is understandable, it is relatable. What we do is easily embraced by those in Asia, those in Africa, those in Latin America. What you do is out of the reach of many people in many parts of the world. So the proverbial solutions for the bottom of the pyramid, by the way, and that bottom is really large, it's like 6-7 billion people, if you remove the Atlantic countries, find greater coherence with the Indian story than with those that have occurred here. So I don't think we are leading the South, but certainly we are, through our own experiences, building a repository of ideas and solutions that are relatable for the South. And in that sense, we are becoming an important center for the global South and its evolution and journeys.
And speaking of growth, maybe one question on economics, as I know there's in the audience as well, some people working with those issues. So free trade, how does India see that, and is it a value, and how can we sort of put India-EU relations, economic relations, move further in that field?
Look, sitting in Europe, talking about free trade has no meaning. Your most important trading relationship today in our part of the world is with China. Do you have a free trade agreement with them?
No.
Do you have free trade with China? But you have trade with China. You have perverse trade with China. And so, for this continent to talk about free trade is rubbish. I find it pointless to discuss free trade with Europe, who is willing to bend over backwards and trade with China at any cost. So, get some spine, get a spine that has trade written on it, then we will talk about free trade with Europe. The reality is that the biggest trading partners around the world don't have free trade agreements that govern it. US and China, for example. Europe and China, for example. So there are no role models for us to chase. Once you find those, please tell me and I'll come back with an answer. But we certainly have, we certainly have focused on building trading relationships with countries which are more specific, which are boutique, which are based on the specific requirements of the two countries. There is no homogeneous universal formula that works for everyone, but we have recently signed an EFTA agreement with your neighbors, Norway, for example, yes. Where we have created a win-win framework where we open our markets, they invest into building India, and we have created a framework. So I think there is a requirement for focusing on trade, but not of the variety that you idealize because you don't live it. You don't live by that formula. You trade with everyone and anyone.
But we need two spines now, according to my accounts.
So security and trade. Yeah?
Yes.
Okay.
So we'll move on and see how many spines we need at the end of the discussion. But yes, noticing of course that you have been concluding free trade agreements, but EU still on the sidelines.
EU is still demanding.
Yes.
There are 27 countries. All of them want one thing special in that free trade agreement. India has to give 27 special things. It's a very difficult agreement. It's an unfair agreement. That every participant in the EU would want something special for their country. And the receiving country has to give 27 accommodations. So it's a very difficult agreement. EU has to understand it. It's not worth it. At the end of the day, you are 250 million people talking to a country which is 1.5 billion people, and you are seeking concessions that are going to implicate much vaster number of lives. So you have to understand that you have to moderate your expectations at the current per capita income levels of India. And I would think about having a graduated FTA, which becomes more ambitious every 5 years as we move from $3,000 to $6,000 to $10,000 per capita income. And at that time, you should start expecting more from us. So I think you have to be easy on us as we walk up the ladder. And if you demand too much at this stage, you are going to cripple the economy and the purpose of the trade agreement itself. Although I'm bullish that it's going to happen.
Yes, and the clock is ticking, so we need to move on. There's so many interesting issues, and one is, of course, India's relations to what we would term great powers, although I'm aware that India doesn't want great powers to define your own interests. But could you say a few words about India's relations to China in light of some territorial issues having been taking place in the past, also China's increasing influence, but still, as a trading partner, how do you see China?
India's relationship with China have a history, and now have a modern context as well. The history has been territorial disputes. The modern context is China's determination to rewrite not only the political maps, which means the boundaries, but also the political order, right? In nutshell, China is expansionist both in its territorial designs, but also in its influence and control over key domains that matter to countries. Let me give you two examples, or rather, let me simplify it for you. I have said this earlier, and I'll say it again, that the Chinese seek a multipolar world. When they talk to the Americans, they don't want Pax Americana, they don't want the American hegemony and the American trading systems and the American financial systems to dominate, the dollar to dominate the world. They want to find, fixes to American dominance. So China wants a multipolar world when they argue with the Americans, but they want a unipolar Asia. They want an Asia which is, Pax Indica, which is centered around Chinese design, Chinese ambitions, Chinese aspirations, Chinese control. So there is a problem there. It's not something that many of us in Asia are going to admit and agree to, right? So the Chinese are paid today, by the way, due to their own actions. It's not some great conspiracy or collusion. It is a response to China that there are number of actors in Asia that reject that kind of a Chinese approach. Even within the ASEAN, there are discordant voices, and ASEAN itself may find it difficult to reach any agreement which is loud and coherent. But individually, the ASEAN countries, for example, Indonesia, for example, Philippines, for example, sometimes even Malaysia, you will find that there is a disagreement with China's role in Asia, its activities in Asia, and its certain economic influence in Asia, which is leading to perverse outcomes, like we saw the balance sheets, the frail balance sheets of many island states in our neighborhood, where we've had to bail them out. You've had to bail them out. So the Chinese come, create these perverse debt traps, and then the world is cleaning up the Chinese mess. So there are a number of issues with China, and yet I can tell you that our trading relationship remains robust. We have excluded China from certain sectors, so which is sensible. We don't want the Chinese presence in certain sectors, for example, telecom, for example, 5G, for example, Chinese social media apps, gaming our open public sphere. Democracies should not allow authoritarian regimes to game their discussions. They will not allow Indian social media presence in their debates. Then there needs to be a far more vigilant reciprocal system with the Chinese when it comes to certain sectors. Otherwise, I think they're an important actor, an important trading actor, which is essential for many of us in the world simply because of the concentration of certain manufacturing capacities that they possess. So we will have to engage with them. We will have to create diversification over time. We will have to build resilience into the system. And with the Chinese, you will have to take the good and the bad together.
And if we move on to another player, relations to...
And by the way, it's not it's a serious situation on the border. So it's not as mild as you suggested in your introduction to that problem. It's a little far away from you guys, so you don't want to pretend it's happening. But we have a live border. We have an active border with the Chinese, I don't know the numbers, but over 100,000 troops easily from both sides facing off, barely meters from each other with guns drawn. So it is a live border with a live situation. And if that was happening in Europe, you guys would be far more concerned. So it is a fairly significant issue that's still unfolding on my country's border.
And if we move on to a conflict that is a bit closer to us and relations with Russia, India's relations with Russia, it's of course the Western allegations of India not having condemned Russia enough. We all know those, and also for not supporting the sanctions against Russia and not condemning in the UNGA voting, for example. These have been all raised in the West. And Modi is now also re-elected, planning a visit to Moscow. So how do you respond to these Western allegations? What is the view that you want to convey to us?
People keep telling me that, people keep asking me, what is the West? Let me ask you, what is this Western allegation? Has Biden accused India of this? I'm asking seriously, has Macron accused India of this? I really want to see that accusation from a European leader who has accused India of this. Or are you saying that those who do not understand world affairs alleging this against India? I really want to understand. Is there a specific allegation from a specific leader that says that India is doing this?
I guess it's more in the policy community.
I heard American diplomat explain to his people that it is very important that India actually import oil from Russia and keep Russian oil in the energy system so that all of us are able to use it. I heard an American explain to his own people. It was not an Indian conference. He was talking to some people in New York in an American audience. So I don't understand. I think this is a bogey. I think this is rubbish. So I don't respond to these things. You use Russian oil. Your cars have it. Thank us that you get it through us. So the day the Europeans stop using oil at all and ban all gas stations in your continent, you should not raise this issue, because you are the largest consumers of Russian oil, processed in different parts of the world, reaching here and America. There is no other two geographies in the world that use more Russian oil than you guys do. So burn your cars, burn your gas stations, stop using oil and gas. Otherwise, don't be sanctimonious.
So Europe
it is reaching you.
Europe should be thanking India for
yes. And I said this, that please understand your inflation is not blown up and your economies are not struggling even more and you are able to maintain a facade of virtuosity with your people by this sleight of hand. You have deliberately chosen to take a rather feeble moral high ground while actually benefiting from Russian oil for your own needs. That is a reality. That is what numbers will tell you if you go down and do a scan of where does that oil go.
Has a European leader thanked India?
I'm sure they do. I haven't been inside a room with European leaders, so I can't comment on that. But if you look at the sanction regimes, if you look at the European regime that talks about if Russian oil is processed significantly in a geography, it no longer remains Russian. That is a way to basically say that any Russian oil that is refined outside can then be seen to be devoid of nationality and can be utilized in any part of Europe. That's a European regulation.
So if we talk about the aggression against Ukraine, what would be the sort of solution for that? Is there a solution?
Look, I think the solutions have to be organic and it has to come from the region. I don't think countries like India should be finding and imposing and suggesting solutions. We should not get into the European habit of finding solutions for everywhere else in the world. Let the Europeans find solutions to their own problems. But I have said it before and I'll say it again, Russia is in complete violation of international law and there is no if and but about it, and it must be condemned. Like India has condemned every other violation of sovereignty in the last 20 years, be it the Americans, be it the French, be it the British, be it the Chinese, we must also criticize the Russians. There should be no ambiguity on that. That's one reality. The second reality is that the solution has to be regional. It has to be discovered here. It has to be something that works for the Ukrainians, works for the Russians, works for both. So clearly there is a work to be done, and I think the continent has to find its solution. I don't think Indians should be getting into this business of finding solutions for others. I don't think we are good at that.
And not to forget, of course, the United States, also an important player in the world.
And a very important partner again.
So how do you see a potential new Trump administration?
You know, again, that's a very interesting question, and I don't know how to answer that, because I'm not convinced that the American state changes so dramatically with the institutions that it has, just because you have a different president. I think the security establishment in America, the intelligence establishment in America, the economic establishment in America, the markets and the private sector, which is the most important part of America, they don't necessarily change their worldview just because you change the president, right? And if past is any indication, the Indian relationship was very robust and sturdy under all administrations. So post-Clinton, if you look at the whole period, you know, in fact, Clinton's second term, and then Obama, and then, you know, 2 terms of Obama, then the term of Trump, and now 1 term of Biden, we've seen literally bipartisan support and consensus on driving that relationship forward. And every president has contributed to strengthening that relationship, including Trump, and now Biden. So I don't see the India-US relationship necessarily struggle with any change in administration. I think we have a sweet spot in America's foreign policy landscape.
Excellent. I think the clock is ticking way too fast, and we are moving, you know, to the end of the session. I still had a few climate questions, but maybe somebody in the audience will tackle those, because I want to give still a few possibilities for comments, for questions, if you allow me to go a few minutes over time. I see at least 1 hand up, 2 hands, so I'll allow 2 questions. We start with Ambassador Nyberg and then Professor Teivainen.
Thank you, sir, thank you, sir. I'm René Nyberg, former ambassador to Moscow and Berlin, and I have to say that I enjoyed this session very much. And thank you for your almost entertaining way of putting things straight. Xi Jinping is on record of criticizing the Russian loose talk about nukes, about the threat of using nuclear weapons. Am I right that this is also the Indian view of loose talk about nukes? My second question would be about nuclear power, which you build, which is solely Russian in India. But as far as I understand, your building of renewables is so massive that nuclear power is actually not the solution to the Indian energy problem. My third question would be about Russian weapons. You are the biggest, one of the biggest clients of Russian weapons, but as far as I understand, you're trying to get rid of, you're trying to diversify. Sorry for 3 questions.
Yes, that's a smart way, of course, of having many questions at one time, but all good questions, I'm sure. Did you get them all? But maybe, do we take Teivo's question as well? Yes, so please, Professor Teivo.
My one question has only 2 parts. I'm Teivo Teivainen, professor of world politics at the University of Helsinki. I used to be very much into, I was supposed to become an India researcher, but then things happened, but I'm coming back. One of the questions I was thinking about, apart from your excellent comments on oil and on free trade in Finland, like in many other countries, we have this tendency to talk about free trade agreements when the agreement names actually don't have free trade. They are just trade agreements, because often they don't have that much to do with free trade, but still we use that language often. So I'm glad you pointed out some issues about that. About the future and China. Now with BRICS expansion, so how this, because there's this talk about, like, if BRICS expands, does that one could imagine it becomes more balanced and internally multidimensional and all that, and others are saying when it expands it becomes more like not ABC but CAF, China and friends. How do you see the scenarios in expansion of BRICS, let's say before Finland joins, that you referred to, but even before that, like, will it help it, the sort of the tensions between India and China there, or in general attempts of China to sort of dominate through BRICS? Will expansion, some scenarios, help it, or will it mean more China focus within BRICS? I think I'll leave it there and not go to the second question.
Thank you so much, and please.
Okay. So, lots of questions. Let me try and answer. So, on the nuke part, yes, you're right. Loose talks on nuke should be avoided. And I don't know if there's an official Indian statement on this. I won't be surprised if there is. But certainly, this should be any position that nuclear powers should not saber rattle. We have said the same about Pakistan using language that keeps threatening to deploy its weapons against India. So I think the Indian position on nuclear saber rattling not being part of any diplomatic vocabulary is a well-known fact. And I don't know if they've specifically said this on this occasion, but certainly that's my view. So nuclear saber rattling should be condemned in all variety. On the nuclear program, look, it is not, I think just a correction, it is not solely Russian nuclear program. It is more than Russian nuclear program. There is a largest component of Indian nuclear program and nuclear energy program. We've had, yes, partnerships with the Russians, we've had partnerships with the French. We have also had partnerships with other European countries on some elements of our nuclear energy program. So we have a very wide basket of actors who have participated in our civil nuclear energy initiatives over the years. So yes, that has been a central feature of our self-reliance in some sense in the previous century. It has been overshadowed by our rapid strides around solar energy and the renewable sector most recently. In fact, I was reading a report which says that next year India is going to add 35 gigawatts in just renewable energy in 1 year. That is the kind of pace we are reaching, right? This is what countries in this continent have as their total installed capacity. So we are installing in 1 year what you would have as total installed capacity in many countries in this part of the world, right? So, but I see now a sense of renewed vigor in focusing on the nuclear energy sector. I think there is a realization that for baseload purposes and for stability of grid purposes and stability of operation purposes, India needs to continue to develop and invest into its nuclear energy sector. So I suspect in the decade ahead, you might see a new vigor becoming apparent. Although I would concede that in the last 20 years, it's been a renewable story. It's been a story of renewables, which is not a bad thing, by the way, which is a good thing for the world and for all of us. On the weapons part, on Russian dependence, I think that was a question, India's dependence on weapon systems. You know, I always tell people that there are two stories about this. One is India seeking diversification and seeking other sources, and that's one story. And you can see, certainly you can see parts of that in greater display in, for example, our Air Force. You will see from the helicopters to the transport planes to our fighter jets. Our most important parts of our Air Force is now non-Russian. American and French presence is visible, and it is now also symbolic in many ways that our most important fighter planes are no longer Russian, they are French. Similarly, our most important mobility planes are now American and not Russian. Both of these used to be Russian until a couple of decades ago. So you've seen in Air Force and Navy specifically a clear, visible, in some sense, broadening of the basket of suppliers. Not so much in some of our more traditional land forces. And for that, I have always argued that we have two active borders, one with Pakistan and one with China, and we can't take a sabbatical. We can't tell them to hold on, we need a few years off to change to reorient our weapon systems. That is more slow, that is more gradual, and that is also going to happen. For example, the mountain guns that we have acquired from the Americans and some other equipment that we are gradually inducting into our land forces. So that is one story, that India is diversifying away. The second story is that India's appetite for defense equipment is growing as its economic size grows. You know, at $10 trillion, we will have a $200 billion budget a year. $100 billion would be on capital equipment. Even if India buys 1/4 of it from overseas, assuming that we have indigenized a lot of our requirements, but even if we have to import $25 billion from overseas, can Russia meet it? What is the percentage of that Russia can meet? Russia is counting itself out of the India story simply by not building its economic and industrial base. Russia ceases to be a relevant actor in 10 years' time unless it goes through dramatic modernization of its defense industrial capabilities and its economic architecture generally. It doesn't have the industrial production capacity to cater to even a fraction of India's imports 10 years from now. So it is increasingly becoming less relevant to our future. Does it answer your question?
Yes, and I think you're right on the last point. Right? Russia's not able to deliver, and it's technology from a technological point is far behind.
Correct. So I'm saying Russia is counting itself out of the story. So one is India seeking diversification, the other is Russia not doing enough to keep itself relevant. There are two parts to this story. The professor of world politics, welcome back to India, and please do come and visit us. I always tell people that this is the most exciting decade in this phase of India's story. In the next 10 years, we are moving from 4 trillion to 10 trillion. We are adding 6 trillion to our GDP on an annual basis, 3 trillion to global trade on an annual basis, 2.5 trillion to global shipping on an annual basis, 1.5 trillion to the trade that moves through the Mediterranean every year. And that's a dramatic change in how India is going to implicate you and your lives in the coming decade. I think that's the India story. So in some sense, engage with us, study us, infect us with your advice, get infected by our experiences. Don't be surprised by us 10 years later and say, but India is like this. India was always like this, you never paid attention. Just because we speak English doesn't mean that we mean English. We use words differently. We have different contexts, different histories through which certain words are trying to explain certain realities, right? So engage with India. This is the most important decade of this stage of India's journey. On BRICS and China and expansion, look, there are two forces. There are two forces within BRICS, and I have no hesitation in saying it because I have been part of BRICS since 2008. I lead the India's BRICS Think Tank Council. The BRICS Academic Forum is something that my institution is the permanent member of from India. And since 2008, we hosted the first track 2 of BRICS in New Delhi in 2009. So I have been intimately connected. I've written 2 or 3 books on BRICS. So I understand that grouping. But there are two forces that are at play at any given point of time. One is an anti-Western group force that make this an anti-Western group. Earlier it was the Russians that were making it the anti-Western group. Now it is the Chinese who want to make it the anti-Western group. Now both of them have in the last 2 years joined up and want to make it the anti-Western group. So one is that force. This is an anti-Western group. So let's give alternatives that oppose, that challenge, that revise, that alter, that amend what exists. The second that we have always represented, and I would, based on the last so many years, willingly say that the Brazilians and on occasions the South Africans have also supported, is to see BRICS as a non-Western grouping. It is not anti-Western, it is non-Western. So come up with alternative solution. It is not to oppose someone, it is to propose something different. It is to be more inclusive. It is to serve different constituencies. It is to serve the next 7 billion that the Atlantic system failed to serve. It is to find solutions for issues of employment and literacy and questions of gender and others that still continue to persist in our parts of the world, which are no longer form part of the matrix of your priorities. You're all busy with the Ukraine war. You don't even have development budgets anymore to share with the developing world. SDG has taken a hit because all the budgets are now going to fight the war rather than to fight poverty and to fight illness and to fight disease. So the other is a non-Western grouping that wants to focus the agenda on finding solutions and prioritizing issues that don't seem to be part of agendas of other institutions and other parts. So this is the two forces. What will prevail is a matter of time. Like I said, earlier it was the Russians, then the Chinese, now both of them together. As our GDP grows, as our partnerships grow, as our engagements grow, you will see a great, this matters of time. This is temporal. But it's a consensus grouping, which means no single actor can run away with it. So it will never be a China grouping. To answer your question directly, that this will never be a China grouping.
Thank you so much, Mr. Saran. And at every good party, there's somebody saying thank you and apologies for everything I've done. Now I want to thank the audience for the good questions, the patience, and apologize for running late. Usually I'm very strict with time, but this was so interesting. Once again, let's give Mr. Saran a hand.